And we'll get started in just a moment. Wait for a couple more people to join us. Welcome to today's HathiTrust Community Week session titled Supersets and Subsets, a snapshot of a local collection during ETAS and beyond. I'm Heather Christensen, Program Officer for Collections at HathiTrust. I use the pronouns she and her, and I'll be your facilitator for this session. Next slide. First, we want to take a minute to remind you all that HathiTrust events adhere to our Member Meeting and Community Week Code of Conduct, which you see here, which will be posted in the chat. So I'm not going to read it, but just please keep this in mind. Next slide, please. A little housekeeping before we get started. Be sure to keep your cameras off and your microphone muted for today's presentation. Please type questions into the chat at any time. I will read the questions out loud at the end of the presentation. My colleague Christina Hall will be monitoring the chat. My colleague Erin Elkis will be providing support for this session. So if you're having any technical issues, please send a chat message directly to him and he can help. A live transcript is available for this presentation if you click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. We plan to post the recording on our YouTube channel, and we'll also email you a link to the recording and slides after the presentation. And a reminder of our social media hashtag, and that we encourage your participation in our HathiTrust Slack community. And you can tag Jeff for this session. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Kosokoff, Associate University Librarian for Collection Strategy at Duke University, to start our session. And over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Heather. I'm Jeff Kosokoff. I'm the Assistant UL for Collection Strategy at Duke. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from land that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among a number of indigenous peoples, including historically the Shatori and Catawba people. I'm glad Chris did this in the previous presentation. I'll do it too. I'm standing in front of you, but an army of people stand behind me, and particularly for this project, Matthew Harrington, Dee McCullen, and Angela Zoss did a ton of work to give me data that was easy and fun to play with, so I appreciate that. And I also wanted to really call out Hadi, obviously for what you've done with ETAS and with Hadi itself, but also putting together, what to me has been a really great week to both learn about Hadi and sort of progressively work through what's going on with it now. So I'm going to have some themes that run through this. I may not talk about these straight up, but I think it's really important for Duke to think about what we were going to do after ETAS. We turned ETAS off when we started circulating books again in August. Our data is messy. I think it's super important to normalize our data and to slice and dice it a little bit. Duke isn't one library, and so decisions we make are actually decentralized, even around Hadi, what gets digitized, things like that. And you'll see that as well as we move through here, particularly that our professional schools have their own libraries under their own administration. And I think it's important we think about who we're doing what we're doing for. This came up earlier. I'll talk about it a little bit later. What's useful about a book depends on who needs to use it, and what format makes sense will vary a lot. I think that particularly is discipline specific or even library practice specific. So I'll talk a little bit about what we did with our data to make it work and to summarize a little bit. I'll show you some of the tables I've come up with so far, and then at the end talk about what we might do with that information going forward here at Duke or as a community. So first, data gathering. Those of you that have worked with ETAS know this is a little snapshot out of the report you get showing what is in ETAS, the lowest possible OCLC numbers and local bib numbers. But as has come up previously, things that say deny in the access column in the table you get are the ETAS titles, and we use this table to enable links in our catalog within a few weeks of turning on ETAS. That drove users straight to log in if they weren't logged in, access the book in Hati, etc. I'll say usage reports we get from Hati do include a fair amount of bibliographic data, but of course, I really wanted to look at more than just bibliographic data, like who has the book, whether it's out, etc. I'll show you that in a second. But also, we actually have never done analysis on what we have that's in Hati, and we don't know what we have that isn't or isn't. We've just never done that here at Duke, and so this was an opportunity to really pull together a lot of data about what is a pretty big collection. So this is what the table, one of the snapshot of one of the tables looks like once we did a bunch of work to normalize and clean and create sort of derivative fields. So a good example is that we have due dates, which on the day we ran the report, we weren't circulating books. Those books were out. I wanted the words because it's easier to read and sort and things, were books out or not. We have nice codes about sub-library and collection that come out of Aleph, and we turned those into the names of places so that they'd be easier, again, human readable. I think originally we might have taken this into Tableau, and we still might do that, and obviously having these mappings will be helpful. Call number is a little trickier. We keep it both in the item and the bib, so we pull all our call numbers in together. And then for my analysis, I really care about the first and second letter of the LC class to start getting at subject. I say second letter. I haven't done that analysis yet, but you'll see some first letter analysis in a second. So just want to show you some examples of data and what the takeaways might be from that. So one big use case we found, we started seeing a bunch of really odd books showing up in our heavily used list. And it turns out our tech services folks from special collections were heavy users of ETAS. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But the idea here is they had two use cases in mind. One was they had a digitized book locally and they needed to look something up in a reference book to understand what was going on, or a book they would use as reference. The other use case we saw for special collections was to compare editions. And in this sense, ETAS allowed us new kinds of access because not only do we have our own book, which might not even be in Hati, but we could see everybody's copies of those books. And that's a good example of why the collections committee a couple of years ago talked about how different scans are not really identical to each other in lots of ways. And in fact, I think we found we were on the wrong bib a couple of times because when we looked at the ETAS copy, we realized our copy wasn't identical to one elsewhere. We saw a lot of use of sets and continuing resources. The way Hati's controlling access at the bib level means that there is access to things that you don't have in a set, it looks like to me. And so we saw quite a lot of our heavy use titles were things that are multi-volume. Luther's Works, which I think is Martin Luther's Works, a 50-volume set, got used a lot. None of the individual volumes got used a lot, but the set got used a ton. Our heaviest use was in these LC classes. I think B is a funny one to play with, as is P, since those really hold things that distinct scholars don't work across all of them. You can say the same thing about history with D, E, and F, but our heaviest use is in those call numbers. And then we are able to see that the use of materials by language really closely follows our own local collection in terms of the proportionality. I'm not sure if that's happening because that's also what our catalog would be like, or if it's actually because we collected really well and we bought just enough of everything here at Duke. I think it's probably a little of each. So some data about ETAS, a little more about ETAS. And as I said before, we've turned ETAS off, and we would only turn it back on if we stopped circulating books again, I think, which obviously might happen. We hope it won't. But Duke had about 1.2 million titles that were available, newly available through ETAS. Of those, 6,871 got used, so about 0.5%. Most of that use was one view with no renewals. And we didn't want to, I don't want to say there's something somehow not good about that use, but from the sense of blocking access, we were concerned about whether one view really counted as heavy or important use in the way that obviously heavy use did, and we had a lot of very heavily used titles as well. 45 titles were used over 10 times, which is to say they were borrowed on 10 different days. We happen to know that on the day we started ETAS, 13% of the books that were in ETAS were already checked out. And just something interesting for us, no books were checked out, obviously, and got used during the time period with only 6,800 being used. So here's in the previous session, we talked a little bit about how use might vary by discipline, and this is kind of a related case to that. So these are the individual administrative units of libraries at Duke, and how many of their books were in ETAS of that 1.2 million, and how much they make up of the overlap. And here's the use of books based on what library they were from. And I really want to point out what happened with our divinity library, which is that while they contribute relatively little to ETAS, their stuff was used more heavily than might have been predicted by the 7% of overlap. This is consistent with local data we have about high print use among our divinity school community, especially the graduate students. They are by far, for example, the #1 borrowers of journals, because we do loan out our bound journals. Here's ETAS by call number. Most use call number at the top, least use at the bottom. Just again, this is titles that got used. What I want to point out here is that what we're seeing is, again, disproportional use. So in the Bs, things got used more than you might have thought they were, more at a higher rate, I would say, than other areas. I've got to break the Bs down. I don't have the data yet together on is that religion or psychology or philosophy, but there it is. To me, again, what would you do about this? Is this a problem? Is it an opportunity? How would you go after it? And we'll talk about that right at the end. Here you are versus holdings, more generally for Hati. So I guess what I want to say here is this isn't about ETAS anymore. Now, how do you think about what you have versus what's in Hati? And you can see the proportionality of our collections. This is just interesting for me anyway. But you can see what the total numbers in Hati. And then I wanted to point out law is a very interesting case. We have more bids than Hati in exactly one area, and that's law. And I was talking to Heather about this. I think law may be underrepresented in Hati, and that can represent a certain kind of opportunity. Relatively little other stuff is in there, and obviously we have things Hati doesn't. I'm sure we have things Hati doesn't all over the place, but especially there, we do. And so what would we do about this? So this is what we do with it part. This is good. I'm leaving 15 minutes for questions. This is really perfect. So I have 4 things I want to show you. They're things we could talk about or not. We have those 45 titles that were heavily used, and we need to look hard at what those are, what years they are, what kinds of things they are. As Chris mentioned in the previous presentation, think about whether they could be licensed, because that's in a lot of ways the cheapest and best path for us. But we're going to have controlled digital lending here at some point. We're part of the ReadShare pilot. And so I would say if they're eligible by policy here, which we haven't developed yet, maybe we should digitize those things and put them in CDL. So that's one. We talked about law a little bit, but this happens a lot by language, especially at a place like Duke. Do we have a lot of something and Hati has relatively little of it? We do have an Internet Archive scribe, which, while it doesn't scan things quickly, can scan things, and everything we put on the scribe ends up in Hati one way or another. Maybe we could look for ways to do more digitization. In our case, the law library, as I mentioned, is a separate administrative unit, so it's also worked with them to see if they'd like to digitize what they have, or if that's appropriate. But maybe that's a strategy we can take off of that from the generalized data, not about ETAS, but just about what our overlaps look like. I think we have massive opportunities to do, because we don't spend a lot of time advertising HTRC, but we have places where our local collection aligns very well with what's in Hati. Some languages, you have everything we have, for example. Maybe there are copies, I'm not sure. If there's a lot of something in Hati, our people should be thinking about using it more for distant reading, non-consumptive reading. So I think we have some opportunities there as well, and this data should help lead us in that direction. And just to come back to tech services for a second, I think there's a real opportunity here to think about how the corpus could be made available to people for doing descriptive work, comparing editions, again, looking at reference, things like that. So we could digitize those things. Obviously, if we'd known we would all be at home for this long, we would have digitized a bunch of different things to support that use case here. But I also wonder whether that's fair use, and I have reason to believe it would be fair use. And so there, I suppose, is an opportunity if the infrastructure can support it, for example, for creating a tech services user in Hati, and then we could assign individual catalogers that user, and that user would be allowed greater access than we typically see for the collection. That's all I've got. I'm happy to go back and talk about things, and happy to hear your questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. We have not gotten a question in the chat, but let me give people a moment here. What questions do we have for Jeff? I mean,
Happy to go back to some of the slides too, if folks want to look at something in more detail. I know I whizzed through that a little bit.
So we do have one question here. Could you describe what your next steps are for analysis in more detail?
Sure. Let me go back. And I say that knowing Angela's here. Angela's one of our system librarian here, and did a lot of the final work to finalize the data. But just looking at this table, for example, I need to get more granular about subjects here. I mentioned the Bs. The Ps are the other huge opportunity here. I need to understand where the use is by language a little better, where the interest is. I haven't compared this to local circulation numbers yet, so that's another piece we probably have to bring in. So that's a big piece. Part of this depends a lot at Duke, and now is a strange time, obviously, about how much digitization we're going to do beyond what we've been doing. Our digitization operation is relatively small, and except for the scribe is focused pretty much entirely on special collections and high quality but low throughput scanning. But anyway, so I need to break down the call numbers better for sure. I didn't show you the language data. I need to break down that better for sure. And then I'll say, going back to sort of broader data here, we need to look more closely at who owns books. And so you can see that sort of sprinkled throughout here, but our music library is pretty interestingly represented in Hati. So we need to sort of pull out those areas, I think, that are more available, less available, more well represented, less well represented. Yeah, I guess that's what I've got so far.
Thanks, Jeff. We do have a couple more questions here. From Greg Murray, he asks, I missed where all your data came from. Is it the Hathi files?
Oh, sure. So yeah, sorry, I was in the right place before. So this was the main file we get from Hati, right? It's obviously, 1.2 million, well, it's actually over 3 million rows, because that's what we send. That's the complete set of everything we got with overlap report from Hati. And so we enhanced this entire table with information from Aleph. So we have Aleph. It was bib data and item and holdings data from that system. We did that for every single title, and then that was what we cooked. And we also added rows, all the corresponding rows to the used titles. The 6,800 titles also had the same rows added. So this is an example, and everything you're seeing here either came from using the bib.sys, the local control number, either came from a bib record, an item record, holdings, or through enhancement steps we took to use these to calculate new fields like that call number field, the LC class field, or the out not out, or some of the location information might have also come from there as well. Thanks for asking.
Thanks, Jeff. So another question, if everyone does more local digitization and controlled digital lending, then we don't have a centralized repository like at HathiTrust. Will you be submitting to HathiTrust as well?
I think so. We don't have CDL yet. When we do, I would think we would deposit everything into Hati. That's what we do with our scribe now. Even if we publish it open through Internet Archive, we still deposit it into Hati. we think the Hadi copyright regime can take over and do what it wants to do with those copies, and that seems acceptable to us. You know, it has come up locally about what if Hadi did control digital lending, and that is a huge question and very complex to solve, and I don't think something Hadi will be able to get to in the next year or two, whereas we can get CDL up and running, we think, within the year. But no, I don't see these as mutually exclusive at all. I think to that question, I think it's a good question, and we I will also say in terms of sharing, we don't see any reason why we couldn't think about loaning our control digital lending copies to anyone who would nominally be able to borrow from Duke. So this will come up for us in TRLN and Borrow Direct, where we have highly integrated returnables systems. We don't see any reason why having it for CDL means CDL only for Duke at this point, and we just have to think how we can make that work in a way that's going to be compliant and useful to people.
Thank you. All right, so Miranda Bennett asks, did any of your analysis suggest how ETAS might have been used to support teaching and learning? And maybe that's hard to tell, given that it was active mostly in the summer.
Yeah, that's a good point. It was, by the time we got it up, it was beginning of April, and we only had about 4 weeks left in the semester. And the links had just been up for a few weeks at that point. But no, I don't. And it's one of the real, there's a general set of questions about how we think about how this can even integrate with coursework. So learning is a funny thing. If you're talking about courses, we didn't think Hadi was adequate for that. One user at a time doesn't meet a reserves need, for example. It's one of the reasons why we needed to think differently about it. We did purchase a few things because they were used in ETAS. Someone asked for something, we went back and found, oh, we can get a copy of that, or scan a chapter, or scan an article. One thing I pushed pretty hard on was when we did hear back from faculty, and it was only faculty for the most part, can ETAS stay on forever? Was sort of what the heavy users wanted to stay on. And I understand why. We would push back with, well, what is it for? Like, that's fine, great, but tell us why. And the why was inevitably for course use. And they would have a reading list. And when we looked at the reading list, we thought we can meet this need better if we scan chapters, buy a couple books. You're using a journal that we actually have online access to, here's where it is. So we were, I think that was a teaching and learning thing we got. I will say also, and I think, I want to say Christina helped us with this, we did have somebody who wanted access to something, and when they asked Hadi through Hadi support for their own research, Hadi was like, oh yeah, that should be open, and you all opened it up for us. So for all of us, I should say, and that was pretty cool. But not really. I would say the other thing is we don't really have any user data, right? We don't know how many people use the service. We know how many people use it every day. We don't know how many people use the service as over all the days. We don't know who those people were. We have no demographics on that. We would get a little bit from our proxy logs, but that's not really what we need. So I think that's a really good question, sort of about all of our systems. How do we understand who's using them and what they're using them for? And we don't really have a good sense of that with ETAS any more than anything else.
Thanks,
I wish we
Jeff.
could. If somebody's got an answer to that one, I'd love to know it.
So another question from Daniel Dollar. Can you discuss the transition away from ETAS? Have you seen a bounce back of print circulation?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for asking. We started a takeout service. And when I told Hadi about the takeout service, the note back from one of you was, please deactivate. Because we weren't limiting circulation in any way at that point. Takeout's being used a lot. I haven't seen the stats on circulation, but I know it's a pretty steady stream. We're doing it, at least within my unit, at all locations. So yeah, I mean, books are going out. We're not asking for them back. Whenever I'm in the library, I see stacks and stacks of returns. So I think they're moving around. I don't know, and I think the question we need to find out about is how much that is compared to normal. I will say at Duke, and I'm sorry I didn't provide all this context, but we have 15,000 students. The undergrads are pretty much all in Durham. The first and second years are on campus. All the rest are pretty much here, with the exception of a fair number of international students. But we think there's 6,500 students in town. So the takeout service, and I should say there's classes on campus. So the takeout service is being used pretty heavily, we know, by students in some subject areas. Our library that has a lot of our art materials is still doing pretty nice business on that. But yeah, I'm not sure. I think I know where Daniel's question is coming from. I'm not sure how much it would compare to what we would normally do. It's clearly a lot less. And we're not mailing books at this point to our patrons around the country and around the world. So we're not circling as much as we probably could if we did that.
Jeff, we're getting requests for you to sing the library takeout song.
No. But thanks for asking.
We do have another question coming back to this.
I'm glad you all appreciate that, by the way. That was a great thing. Jamie was amazing. So thank you all for watching it and spreading it.
It was an awesome video.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So from Jimmy Gaffrey, with your distributed libraries, was there a need to continue ETAS at some libraries that were not able to open? This could also be a HathiTrust ETAS opportunity for defined subsets of collections that could be offline for any number of reasons. Yeah,
that's a great point. We didn't, as you kind of saw, most of the circulation was out of our main unit. That's the unit I work in. We weren't, I think for us, we weren't prepared to do the lift that we saw as necessary to limit circ. So we didn't know how long we want to keep this on. We wanted print books to move. We had a ton of people asking about print books, especially in the humanities, and I think our divinity library, people really want to use print. I think some of the demand for the Hadi title, the ETAS titles went down when HT moved pretty fast to not have full PDFs up, but only have that single page, no printing view. That drove down demand a little bit from some people. But I think you're absolutely right. I think it would be great if there was a way to do this differentially. I actually don't know off the top of my head whether one of our libraries is still closed to the public, to the community, but it does seem like suppressing parts of the collection would be desirable, because I know, like, we have a lab down in Beaufort, North Carolina at the Marine Lab. There's 26 students down there. I don't know how much they need to be open. It would be nice to shut it down and let the few thousand books they have be available through ETAS. I'll say too, special collections was a driver for us because we needed to use the print. It wasn't, in the context of some of the classes we're getting taught, it wasn't going to work to use the scan from Hadi, partly because it wasn't our copy. And so it really wasn't a hard decision for us in that context, that there were demands that could only be met through turning it off. And we just had to compromise a little on the needs that could be met through print as well. But I think it's a great point. We also should have updated our holdings file. We haven't sent a new holdings file in a long time, so we know we were getting access to things we shouldn't and didn't have access to things we should. We did have a few questions like that, but I don't think it's reasonable to think libraries would correct titles with time, or that HathiTrust staff would work on that. So.
Thanks, Jeff. We maybe have time for one more question, if there are any more. Give everybody a moment. All right, well, thanks so much, everyone. Actually, Carla does ask if we're going to have access to the slides, and yes, we will. We'll be sharing a PDF version of those, and also be posting the video too. But a big thank you to Jeff for the presentation today, and thank you all for attending and being here with us. And we hope that you'll fill out the survey that we'll be sending to you after the fact here, and thanks to you all. Have a good afternoon.